our class. So thank you. All right. Yes, so thank you so much. Please take it away.
Awesome. And first and foremost, Kirby, hopefully this will distract you from your pain, but this goes for everybody. Like, do what you need to do to keep your body comfortable. I'm going to trust that you're paying attention, at least as much as I'm paying attention, so it's an even score. I'm also going to say I'm going to read you. Alex Capitan and I wrote a history of trust that is going to be published in an upcoming Skinner House book, and I'm going to read from that for the history of trust, just because it's better than if I just ramble. And then I'm going to trust that you all will ask questions that you have, and so we'll kind of do like the trust piece, which is the biggest piece, and then we'll do a little bit of pastoral care to trans communities, and then we can talk about Lent and anything else you want to ask me about. My general approach to teaching is ask questions and I will find the answers. I like to facilitate from a place of the choose your own adventure book. So if we go off on a tangent, I'm going to trust that's where we're supposed to go. Does that work for everybody? Awesome. So let me just pull up that document, which is this one. No, that is not that one. It is this one. Okay. So let me just start by saying that if you had told me 20 or more years ago that within a couple of decades there would be over 100 trans religious professionals in Unitarian Universalism, I would not have believed you. Back then, we're talking the mid to late 90s, my highest hope was that maybe, just maybe, I might live to witness a couple dozen of us serving the faith of Unitarian Universalism in professional capacities. I never could have known at the time that Trust, an organization of trans UU religious professionals that was still at the time more an idea than a reality, would so quickly grow beyond my wildest dreams. Trust was not born in a single moment, but over the course of several years, many conversations, and a great deal of need. As one of the few openly trans leaders within Unitarian Universalism in the 90s, I had personally experienced that need and witnessed it in too many others for so many years. I'm the child of a father who worked in human resources and a mother who worked as a UU religious educator and a grandmother who was a Universalist organist and choir director. And so I had a knowledge of how things moved within the faith, both locally and continentally. It gave me a predilection for systems thinking and an awareness of denominational dynamics that I think made a difference when we were starting to create the organization. I had many leadership roles within Unitarian Universalism as a child and as a youth, and I was in my mid 20s when I was hired into the office of, at the time, called Lesbian, Bisexual, and Gay Concerns at the UUA. So I want you to just think back. It was 1995. I was 24. The Welcoming Congregation program was only 5 years old, and only about 30 to 33 congregations had actually voted to be recognized as a welcoming congregation, with maybe a dozen or so more working on the program. The call to become more LGBTQ welcoming was not being taken up by the majority of our congregations, mostly because they had a belief that they were already welcoming enough. But that was predicated on the idea that nobody flaunted their sexuality. When I got hired, I was out about my sexual orientation. The Reverend Meg Riley, who was then the director of both the Office of LGB, LGB concerns. That's really hard to do nowadays without adding the T. Anyway, she was the director of the office there and also of the Washington Office for Advocacy. It wasn't until months after I was hired that I was able to come out, mostly because growing up in Massachusetts, I never heard of transgender identities. They were never defined. I didn't know other people who were trans except for the drag queens that existed in Provincetown. And while I knew they were my people, I also knew that I was not a drag queen. So I struggled with language. And it was shortly after I was hired that Beacon Press published uh, Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors, and I finally had language to define myself. And so I came out as third gender and trans to my UUA colleagues. As a queer and trans person, though, it was frustrating to watch the mainstream UU movement slowly embrace the message of becoming more tolerant of heteronormative gays and lesbians, while continuing to perpetuate oppression and exclusion towards LGBTQ people who weren't interested or able to assimilate into mainstream culture. Matthew She- Matthew Shepard's murder in 1998 and the burgeoning same-sex marriage movement had motivated a lot of our straight cisgender UUs to become active allies. but there was a huge amount of resistance to welcoming or advocating for bisexual, queer, and trans folk. At both state and national levels, I watched as UU public advocacy work on trans rights was intentionally sacrificed in favor of same sex marriage advocacy work with anti trans, interfaith, and lesbian gay organizational partners. So it was an isolating time to be trans, both in Unitarian Universalism and in the wider world. You have to remember that the online forms of connection were in their infancy. Email wasn't yet widespread. In fact, at the time, the UUA did not have email, and long distance phone calls were expensive. So the trans communities that existed only existed in either hyper-local or word of mouth ways. And because of the way systemic oppression operates to turn people with marginalized identities against each other, there was unfortunately also a lot of infighting among the few groups that existed, which often broke down along fault lines of gender identity, race, class, ability, and a desire or lack of desire for medical transition, as well as a desire or ability to be out or stealth. So within Unitarian Universalism, trans leaders were desperately few and far between. And although the denomination had made a commitment with the 1980 business resolution to remove barriers to employment for lesbian, gay, and bisexual religious leaders within the faith, that same commitment had not been made to trans leaders and still wouldn't be for another 2 decades. So there were a few of us in seminary, few ordained, and a few who pursued employment in UU congregations during the 80s and 90s, but no openly trans person was called to serve a UU congregation until 2002. I would later learn of ministers who came out as trans while serving UU congregations before then and were forced to leave, such as the Reverend Dr. Gwendolyn Howard, and others who graduated from seminary but were rejected by the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, such as Aaron Melby, who was only cleared for fellowship after 10 years of working to change the system. We'll never know how many trans leaders we lost due to transphobia, whether because they couldn't make it through the system at all, made it through only to be blocked or pushed out, or were forced to choose between their call to ministry and living openly as their true selves. And meanwhile, for most lay trans UUs at the time, just having a minister who didn't tell them they were going to hell was powerful. The vast majority of cisgender UU ministers were not prepared to offer pastoral care of any kind to trans people, and the most accepting of them were quick to call one of the only or the few openly trans leaders in our faith, including me, whenever someone came out as trans in their congregation. So, in short, trans people were referred to other trans people for support. By the time I entered seminary in 2002 at Starr King, while continuing to work part time for the UUA, Sean Parker Dennison had been counseled to call me, and I had been counseled to call him at least a dozen times by the same person, despite the fact that we had already been close friends for years, ever since attending an F to M international conference in '97. So it wasn't long into our friendship that Sean and I started talking about the need for an organization for trans UU leaders. We were doing our best to support each other and work for harm reduction within UU institutions, but we were too often dismissed or tokenistically relied upon as individuals. As a UUA staff person, I had fought for and provided multiple Trans 101 trainings of the MFC before I even got to Starr King. Yet it was clear that there was a pattern of systemic oppression within the highest levels of the denomination, as well as people with personal prejudice and the institutional power to cause immense harm to aspiring trans leaders. Conversely, Sean asked for trans trainings at Starr King, and those requests were met enthusiastically by then President, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker. So for us, one of the final straws was when, at a 2003 Western Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy retreat in California, a leader said in reference to me, "Things like that shouldn't be in our ministry." I rightly asked to be assigned to a different subcommittee because I refused to have my ministry judged by someone who couldn't see my humanity, but my request was denied. It was clear to me that I was being experienced as a problem or a troublemaker rather than as evidence of oppression baked into the system. So, not long afterwards, Sean and I were talking, as we often did, about our frustration with the lack of proactive action to support trans leaders in our faith. The most visibly openly trans leaders at the time were just the two of us and Reverend Gloria Font, who had been ordained in '99 and was still searching for a congregation. We knew that an organization, even if it was initially just a shell corporation for a couple of us, would have more power than we did individually, because organizations were listened to more than individuals. So we decided right then and there at his kitchen table to start Trust. And we laughed uproariously when we received our first letter addressed to Trust. from the UUA's office overseeing ministerial education and asking for recommendations for trainers for yet another Trans 101 training for the MFC and its subcommittees. So when we talked about the name for this nascent organization, Sean kept bringing us back to the value of solidarity and trust. There was, as you would imagine, so much animosity and distrust created by systems of oppression within and outside UUism. Trans people and other folks with marginalized identities were expected to compete against each other for success according to oppressive standards. So after much discussion, we decided on TRUUST as a slightly forced acronym standing for Transgender Religious Professional Used Together. To this day, I still have folders labeled capital T, capital R, lowercase p, capital U, lowercase s, capital T, with a note that says the P is silent and the S is small. It does make me laugh every time. One of the key challenges we had from the very beginning was who trust would be designed to serve. We felt it was beyond our capacity to serve all trans folks, and we expected both Interweave Continental, which was the member queer organization of our faith at the time, and the UUA institution to live into their commitments to support lay trans UUs. So we decided to focus initially on trans religious professionals. We were committed to trust being not just for ordained clergy or people in the ordination pipeline, but for anyone who is serving in a professional religious leadership capacity, with particular inclusion of religious educators. Sean's dream was that Trust would eventually become a multi-layered organization serving UU religious professionals, lay trans UUs, and our cisgender allies. Our goal for Trust was to advocate for trans religious professionals within the institutional bodies of Unitarian Universalism and also be a place where our colleagues could gather for mutual support. For the first couple of years, we focused on providing trainings and workshops at the institutional level, including even more trainings for the MFC, the UUA staff, and then gatherings of the Liberal Religious Educators Association and the UU Ministers Association, as well as staff and students at both Starr King and Meadville Lombard. We also regularly tabled at Loretta and UUMA events, though we had to say at the time, come talk to us if you're interested in Trust or interested in supporting Trust, because there were so many leaders who didn't feel able to be publicly trans. We were surprised by the number of more seasoned and eldered clergy who came to us and told us that if they were coming out today, they would come out as trans, but that they had made things work well enough to get by and wanted to simply support us from afar. There were also a number of trans seminarians who were scared to be publicly out as trans because of the discrimination they knew we had experienced. Limited as our power was, Sean and I felt that we had enough of it within the wider system of our faith to push for harm reduction and accountability within the denomination in a way that would help those coming up behind us. But there was a cost to being the groundbreakers. Being labeled a troublemaker impacted my ability to navigate through the ministerial credentialing process myself, which has had long-lasting impacts on my professional development and career. As a side note, I'll just say that it took over 20 years from when I became an aspirant to when I became ordained. And all of that is because of the systems of oppression. So being involved in trust and trans advocacy also put Sean's ministry at risk whenever transphobic people occupied congregational leadership roles within the congregations he was serving. It was, as you would imagine, spiritually draining to have to weigh which battles to fight in terms of our energy, time, need for employment, and sense of ethics. These ongoing tensions also strained our friendship. After a few years of trust existing in an informal way, building those relationships and continuing to do trainings and other harm reduction, we received a generous grant from the UU funding panel in 2007. That gave us the push we needed to bring together a steering committee. And we decided to create an initial steering committee that was an intentional mix of publicly trans UU religious professionals, all four of us, and cisgender UU professionals who were trusted allies and willing to leverage their power to support trans leaders. Our new leadership body came together for the first time at a retreat in April of '08. Jamison Green served as a facilitator and created a powerful container for us to build community, relax and restore our souls, and also shift the paradigm to center trans experience. Much of the gathering for me focused on breaking the dynamic of competitive firsts that is so common in mainstream culture. Who was the first trans religious professional, the first openly trans ordained minister, the first openly trans minister called to UU congregation, etc. All of that, there were four of us, and all of that was in the mix. Thankfully, we were able to create an environment where we could all just be together. I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of things, but I'm going to fast forward to the Stern Committee had a second retreat 2 years later in April of 2010, and it was facilitated by Heidi Green. What stands out most for me at that retreat was an exercise she invited us to do, which was to write Trust's obituary, to imagine 20, 30 years down the line that Trust had met its mission and we didn't need it anymore. So we were sunsetting Trust. Sean and I, in particular, were feeling so mired down in the everyday barriers faced by us and all the other trans UU leaders that we knew, we couldn't actually think of anything beyond being able to get me ordained and perhaps having a memorial scholarship for trans people in our names, since both Sean and I were pretty sure we wouldn't live to see this day. But thankfully, the other steering committee members had more hope for the future, which is how Trust's initial vision statement came to be, and I quote, born out of a commitment to the gifts, safety, liberation, and leadership of transgender people. Trust is at the center of a new spiritual awakening that transforms Unitarian Universalism through worship, pastoral care, theology, education, and community to the end that transgender ministers and their ministries are thriving, and a new culture of solidarity and common purpose among Unitarian Universalists committed to countering intersecting oppressions is flourishing. So, not bad for a 2 day retreat. From there, we were able to create a more formalized leadership structure that gave us the gift of no longer feeling so alone in the work and move things forward. We continued at every Laredo Fall Conference and UUMA ministry days to host tables and be as publicly known in leadership circles as we could, but we still weren't connecting with more than one additional trans leader per year. We continued to do education and trainings at the institutional level, as well as advocate for and support the institution of gender neutral bathrooms at General Assembly in 2013. That was the first time we had gender neutral bathrooms. I will also just say, as a side note, that we were successful in doing that because we offered to the GA Planning Committee the opportunity that if it was successful, they could take credit, and if it failed or became problematic, they could blame Trust. I will also say that it was me and a handful of Starr King graduates and students who literally put up every single sign in the convention center on every stall door, on every bathroom exterior door, and all the mirrors, and then continued to replace them as folks tore them down. I like to think that they tore them down because they were such good signs they wanted them and not because they were against trans bathrooms or gender neutral bathrooms. I'll also say that I created the signage, which I love, and that the LA public school system took it from us and used it for them. So, yay, us. Anyway, to go back to the storyline, it was a struggle. And from the very beginning, our dream had been to hold a retreat for trans UU religious professionals. So in 2016, we were finally able to achieve that dream. It took years to plan, starting in 2010, so that's 6 years, but we kept going knowing that we would finally get there. And we did. It was unbelievable to me that when it came time to invite people to the retreat, we sent invites to almost 30 people. So from the mid 90s to the 16s, close to somebody else do the math, whatever the math it is. We went from four of us to almost 30 of us. I never thought I'd live to see that many trans people committed to leadership within our faith. And in the end, 15 of us were able to attend, and even that felt massive. For so long, it had just been me, Sean, Loria Font, and eventually Paul Langston Daly, who came out somewhere in those first few years. We had a loose network of a few others, but it was really just us. So in 2016, the 15 of us gathered in Pacific Grove, California, with Kate Bornstein, who is our retreat leader. We had two UUA staff members, the Dr. Janice Marie Johnson and Reverend Sarah Lambert, both working as co-directors for the ministry, the Department on Ministry. They were there to just bear witness. We also had on our first full day the Reverend Dr. Rosemary Bray McNaught, who is then president of Starr King, and the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who is now the UA president, to provide worship for us. And they brought with them the blessings from DRUM, the Diverse and Revolutionary UU Multicultural Ministries. From the beginning, while Sean and I inhabit different ethnicities, it was important to us to be in partnership with DRUM so that the system could not beat us against each other. And with Sophia and Rosemary there, they brought tales of the first Finding Our Way Home retreat for UU religious professionals of color. And we were able to compare and contrast and inspire and lament the parallels between both organizations' beginnings. It was definitely a transformative experience. Each of us brought wounds and scars, and each of us found healing in community. We honored our rightful place in Unitarian Universalism by telling our stories and imagining our future. We created a history wall where we documented and wove together multiple threads of our individual stories, UU institutional stories, and the wider world with respect to trans and queer folk. Collectively looking at that woven history in broader context helped heal some of the broken relationships that had been created by the wider system and made it possible to celebrate our successes. We officially transitioned the Trust Steering Committee to a trans only leadership body, and we brought three concrete asks to Janice and Sarah as representatives of the UUA. The creation with Trust's help of a network or structure at the UUA to support trans people in Unitarian Universalism, to hold staff who reported to them responsible for doing no harm in those in our community, and funding us for a second retreat. So those 3.5 days represented a huge turning point for Trust. Beyond deepening relationships and building relationship with the leadership of the UUA, perhaps most importantly, we were now firmly a membership organization after years of a loose collection of relationships. This meant new conversations about who would be invited to join, and after much discussion and discernment, the steering committee made the decision to expand membership to all trans UUs living out a call to ministry within our faith. Where before we had been inclusive only of ordained ministers and religious educators and ministerial candidates, now we would be open to ordained and lay ministers, credentialed and non-credentialed religious educators, directors of music, and church administrators, as well as seminarians and chaplains. This move was informed by the expansive definition of religious professionals similarly used by the Finding Our Way Home community, and by the recognition that the barriers to credentialed leadership for trans people within Unitarian Universalism meant that the many trans UU leaders follow non-traditional paths. So that was a huge success. We did a public call. We had so many more folks. We expanded what the word trans meant to be as inclusive as it possibly could. For many UUs, the articulation of a broader understanding of gender was a surprise due to the widespread mainstream mythology that being trans meant being a trans woman or a trans man, full stop. But ironically, neither myself nor Sean ever identified as anything other than what today would be called non-binary. When we founded Trust, Sean identified as gender full, and I identified as third gender, hoping to remind us and everyone else that gender was beyond too. So the fact that so many UUs have thought of both of us as trans men speaks only to the tenacity of the gender binary and the continuing invisibility and erasure of people who don't or aren't appearing to be men or women. Despite our own visibility and relative power in the system compared to many others, we had never been fully understood, valued, or fully able to push for more than the system is willing to give. The final turning point, represented by the 2016 retreat, was much more personal. I felt that I was able to leave the steering committee and receive the gift of being simply a member of Trust, secure in the knowledge that more leaders would carry the organization forward. And sure, they did. Over the next 5 years, the membership grew by leaps and bounds, and by April of 2017, we had 27 members gathering at a retreat out of a membership of 39. And by January of 2019, there were 61 members, 27 of whom attended a retreat. We also saw huge successes in the spring of 2017. 2 trans ministers were settled in new pulpits, both called by unanimous congregational votes. And then, incredibly, in 2019, 7 trans ministers were called or hired into new congregations. Meanwhile, 2 trans non-binary leaders, myself and Alandria Williams, were asked to serve as co-moderators of the UUA, our association's highest volunteer leadership role. And yet, through it all, there was pushback, backlash, and barriers, even when we thought we were moving forward, whether they were about pronouns or bathrooms, health insurance, or any of the other basic needs we have. In 2018, the UUA partnered with the Trust, partnered with the UUA to conduct a survey of trans UUs, and the results were deeply telling. Almost 3/4 of the respondents did not feel their congregations were completely inclusive to them as trans people, and 42% reported regularly experiencing trans-related marginalization in UU spaces. The numbers were far worse when you got into the subgroups of non-binary UUs, trans UU young adults, trans UUs of color, and the most financially insecure of us. Meanwhile, the report named that no openly trans woman had ever been called to a settled ministry position within our congregations, only as interns, contract ministers, interims, or in lay roles. So it's clear that we still had a lot further to go, and yet we had made great progress. Um, so that was 2019. Then to go down a little bit, we had a retreat shortly after the pandemic shut down. I want to say it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and we had almost 100 people there, and that was amazing. So we've come a huge way, and I will stop there for the trust thing. But I will say that, like most things in when we're working with oppression or to counter oppression, relationships, tenacity, and clarity of where you're headed is important. And I'll just stop there for a moment and say, any questions? And now I can catch up on the chat too. Yes, Rachel?
I was wondering if you'd say more about what you envision the formation process for ministry to be, culminating with the MFC. I'm thinking both of all of the adversity that you just explained and also the recommendation and widening the circle of concern to have other pathways to ministry. What would be a radically inclusive and transformative way to have formation work for us?
It's a great question. I think this is where I get stuck. I'm an institutional at heart for sure, right? And so I think there does need to be some process and some credentialing body, right? And with any kind of credentialing body, there's standards of some sort that we need to meet. And having said that, I also think the standards that we have had up until the last 5 years or so have been very much mired in the 1950s, 40s white male heteronormative model of what it is to be a minister, which is grounded in an assumption of Unitarian academics that ignores the universalist side anyway. So I just say that to acknowledge all of that. And a lot of us, yourselves included, come into ministry, into seminary with a heck of a lot of life experience. And so my hope is that we can create systems that acknowledge that life experience and let us build on that and find ways to go through whatever credentialing processes we need to have in a way that supports the student and as in you use when we say the candidate, right? Supports the candidate through the process to get some good profession skills. So I'm thinking sort of like an apprenticeship. Like, what if instead of, spend $100,000 million for an MDiv and then put your whole life on hold for that process to happen, and then do a 1 year internship that's underpaid and doesn't give you what you need? What if there was a 5 year apprenticeship that paid a living wage and gave you access to seminary classes or other forms of education that would meet your learning styles? I will say, having said all of that, like I'm glad I'm not the one that has to design the system, but I do have some hopes for what it can be. And I love that both Meadville Lombard and Starr King are willing to engage in creative thinking to meet the needs of the learners, so that we can have more grounded and prepared ministers. Kirby.
Hi. So I have a question and I apologize, I'm pushing through here. Uh, when you were saying in the beginning that you were being like considered a nuisance, like you're being, so I'm having some issues within Star King right now, kind of like fighting for my life to even be able to attend because of administration stuff and like finances and things like that. And it really did you get to a point, because I've been at a point right now where I need to decide, I'm like, do I change the system from within or do I leave and go do something else? And it seems like you kind of chose to stick it out within for a very long time. What was the just completely selfish personal interest with everything I'm
Yeah,
battling
no, and I'm
right
sorry
now?
I'm sorry you're having a hard time. Um, for me, I'm
Surgery
a
separate from all of that stuff. It's just a shit pit.
yeah, but it impacts, right? Like our
Yeah.
daily lives impacts everything
Yeah,
else.
sorry.
Um, it's all good. For me, part of it was so I'm a fifth generation Universalist, and I'm a fourth generation Universalist church worker. So when I got to the UUA to work, I mean, I knew who I was. I've known my gender since kindergarten, so it wasn't that I didn't know who I was. What I didn't have was the words to tell somebody else my understanding of myself in a way that made sense to anybody besides me. And reading Transgender Warriors gave me that language. So like my coming out, people are like, "Oh my God, this came out of nowhere," and I was like, "No, it's you gave me the language dictionary, and now I can say what is true." But I say that to say part of it was when I every time I hit a barrier, I dug my heels in and kind of in a like this is my faith. Like this is my family's faith. I didn't come here because I'm queer and you're welcoming of me, but now you're being challenged by that. So every time I hit a barrier, my gut response was, we're, if all the queers are coming to Unitarian Universalism, where would I go anyway? And also, this is my church. This is my place. I am exactly who you taught me to be. Now you have an obligation, the colossal you have an obligation to do your work to accept me. And because I have that foundation and I know my family's legacy, I know that I can push you hard and it's not going to challenge my faith. It's going to challenge my belief in the institution, but it's not going to challenge my faith, if that makes sense. So that's how I managed to stay. Plus, I met some really cool people along the way who kept reminding me we were doing good work. And, for me, I had the privilege as a child to literally sit at the kitchen table under the kitchen table while my mom was working with some of the great names in our faith, some of whom were Mark Morrison Reed, who was one of the amazing four front runners of African American UU ministers who are willing to like name the problematics that we have. And if you haven't read his two books, you've got to read his two books. Gene Navius, who was one of the most flaming, beautiful, out gay ministers we could ever have, who is working to create About Your Sexuality, which is the precursor to Our Whole Lives, our comprehensive sex ed. Like, and Dick Gilbert, who's just this amazing white guy who like was a religious educator and understood his privilege in a way that allowed him to leverage it for others, not in a paternalistic way, but in a partnership way. Excuse me. So like they sat on a committee with my mother running Star Island's Religious Education Week. And so four times a year, I literally sat under the table listening to the four of them talk. So to have that and to know that when I hit problems, I could call them and say, what is going on? Is this me or is this the system? And each one of them could just put their virtual it was phone because we didn't have this yet, right? But they could kind of put their virtual hand on my shoulder and say, "You're not alone," and stick with it. We've got you. And that made a difference. Like knowing who you can turn to, knowing who's influenced you is important. Plus, I'm as stubborn as all can be. So those of you that know me outside of this setting know that I am just a stubborn son of a gun. Allison.
Not a question really, just like a wow. Um, because the years you're talking about exactly align with my, sort of like I came of age in like the 80s and studied gender in the 90s and read Leslie Feinberg's other book, Stone Butch Blues, which was like
Mhm.
groundbreaking in this other way. And so I didn't realize that Beacon Press had published Transgender Warrior. I mean, so it's like it's and now and I've seen the switch to gender neutral bathrooms, which I just fucking love. Like I just love it. And every time I see it in a restaurant, in a public space, at GA, of course, but like other places, it's like, okay, we are getting somewhere. And obviously that doesn't change the fact that people are being killed but it's I hearing you talk, it's like it's the closest thing I've come to like living through a major change in the rights of, a certain, well, I mean, maybe that's not true. But anyway, I just want to say wow and thank you. And like, it gives me a lot of hope. Um,
Yeah, me too.
it gives me a lot of hope.
Me too.
And I was wondering, I
Oh,
really like that obituary question. And I was wondering, would I want to write an obituary for Unitarian Universalism? And I don't know. But it's an interesting
mm,
question.
it is. I'll share with you all. So I got hired to work at the UA in the Office of Bisexual, Gay, and Lesbian Concerns, which just for humor's sake used to be called the Office of Gay Affairs. So, we went from the Office of Gay Affairs to eventually being the Office of BGLT Concerns. So, we've come a long way. Keith Cron and I had a sign on our door that said, if you want a gay affair, sign up here. Anyway, so I got hired, and my first day of work was, whatever. And my second day of work, I was sent in an interoffice envelope the manuscript to Transgender Warriors. So Beacon Press hadn't published it yet, and again, no email. It wasn't a thing. So everything was done in interoffice couriers, and we had 3 buildings. And so Meg Riley, who had already moved to Washington, D.C. and was getting the Washington office up and running, was technically still the director of our office. And it was to her, and I had been hired as her assistant. So I called her and I said, "We just got this thing. What do you want me to do?" The question attached to it is, do we want to co-sponsor bringing the author, Leslie Feinberg, to General Assembly for a major workshop? And so Meg, having been the director of the youth office and being somebody who loves to empower other people, said, "Well, go ahead and read the book and tell me what you think and whether or not we should bring the person." So I went home that night and I sat on my couch and I read it, and that's how I figured out I was like I had language to call myself trans. I went into work the next day, forgot to call Meg, but went right to the vice president of the UUA, Kay Montgomery, who was also acting as the director of Beacon Press while they were looking for a new director. And so I just like made an appointment, went to her office, and I said, "Yes, our office definitely wants to bring this author to General Assembly. By the way, I'm transgender. Is there a form I need to fill out?" Because, that's the institutional brain that I have. And to her credit, Kay Montgomery didn't miss a beat. And she said, "No, there's no form, but I can create one if that would make you feel better." And that was how I came out to the UUA. It wasn't until like months later when I was at a book release with Leslie Feinberg and a bunch of UUs that Les had invited anybody who was trans to stand up in the audience. And I stood up and I turned around and I looked at Meg, who was sitting right behind me. I was like, "Oh crap, I forgot to tell her I was trans." But we've, laughed about it. We're good friends and have laughed about it over the years. And she's like, "Yeah, I kind of knew." So it all worked out okay. Yeah, Kitty.
I have 2 questions. First, you noted that what you read is from a chapter in a book that's going to come out. Are you allowed to tell us the name of the book so we can run and buy it when it's available? That's my first question.
Yes, I can tell you that. It is called. Ask your second question. I'll pull up the title. It's
Okay.
like something rainbow or something like that.
Okay.
I know it's such a
Um,
queer thing.
yeah. My second question, because you've mentioned it a few times tonight, and I have previously heard you name you kind of are an institutionalist by heart. That's how you think, that's how you operate. I guess how do you see kind of institutions in terms of kind of doing the work of breaking impressions? And I say that in part because so much of the time it feels like institutions are the things we're having to pull apart and break. And I know that you have spent an enormous amount of time building up institutions to make them better. So how do you think about the role of institutions in general and in particular within Unitarian Universalism?
It's a hard question. Um, I think so. My belief in institutions comes from my theory and belief that groups of humans need a container. And so institutions at their best can be a container for us to gather. They can hold us in love. At their worst, they create barriers to success and flourishment. Is that a word? Um, Allowing people to flourish. I think that you know, at its best, the UUA and all of our UU institutions offer a foundation of collective history and visioning and love. And sometimes the humans that run institutions get so mired in the bylaws or the specifics of the how that we forget that we gathered in the first place to be able to take our collective power and make more good in the world. How's that for an answer? Kevin.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have this has just been amazing. But the question that I want to ask is, just like in terms of now, with everything going on, with all the anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, like hate, like how would you talk about the future, of the LGBTQ movement within Unitarian Universalism? And I know the statistic that I've been seeing is that 20 to 30% of Gen Z, identifies as LGBTQ. And I was wondering, like, yeah, how would you speak to kind of the future, in terms of LGBTQ advocacy? And I definitely want you to talk about UU Lent too, because I know students are really excited about that as well. Thank you.
Totally. All right. Um, so what I'm working on a piece that hopefully I'll have done by this spring in time for Pride season. Um, but I'm working on a piece that's a 30-year retrospective of being out as trans, period, and then within the context of UUism. And I name that because the thing that I keep finding myself saying to Gen Z and the newer folks, whether they're newer in younger age or newer in being out, because right, one of the interesting things about transness and really any kind of queerness is that sometimes we figure it out and we've known who we are our whole lives, and sometimes we figure it out later in life. And that means that you could end up with an 80-year-old who's only been out for a year, or me, a 55-year-old who really has been out for 30 or more years. And so it makes what elder is change. But I say that because one of the things that I find myself saying regularly to the folks who have been out less time than I have is we have survived through the generations, not just the last 50 years or 60 years. Like trans folk have been in existence for as long as humanity has been in existence. And we never have had legal protections in the same ways that we do in this country now, or did up till 2 years ago. Not to say that other cultures haven't at times revered trans people or had official or legal recognitions, but in this country, after the colonization of the country, we've never had the same kind of level of legal protections that folks who have only been out 5 years or less are accustomed to, right? Or like when I came out, it wasn't until I read a book that like literally pages of a book that I knew language to define who I am versus my 13-year-old niece who has already identified her sexual orientation with words that I didn't grow up knowing because she has access to that level of information. And I love that, right? But we have to remember that because as we watch the vitriol of anti-transness happening, that's all a reaction to the success we made in the public realm. The reality is we have always been a community of community care, and we will survive because we are grounded in community care. It would be great if we had the legal protections that we deserve, but we don't need them to survive. And our history will survive even if they take all the flags off of Stonewall and erase us from the plaques. And we have to remember that. And those of us that have been around longer have to be the ones saying that because the youngins, as I love to call them, and again, 80-year-old who's been out 1 year is a youngin for me. So it's not about age, but the youngins only ever knew transness in the positive ways that it existed up until a couple of years ago. And so for them, their entire world has been demolished in a way that it hasn't been for me. And so what we can offer them as religious leaders, whether you're trans or not, is a reminder that our viability is not dependent on the government, though they can make it a lot easier or harder. I think that's what I'd say.
I had goosebumps the whole time. Thank you.
You bet.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, let me talk a little bit about pastoral care to trans people, right? You all read the chapter, or I know we'll get around to reading it, so I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I do want to just name whether you're trans or not, you can provide pastoral care to trans people. I mean, it should be self-evident, but sometimes we need to hear it else. Like all of pastoral care, our job as a pastoral care provider is to meet the person where they are, to recognize what strengths they have, what challenges they have, and to advocate for them to have the resources they need to overcome the challenges that are facing them. And that's true in any setting. So, in order to do that well for trans folk, particularly in this realm, this time period, is to know to some degree what the changing laws are that are going to get in the way, right? Like if you are in a state that has just passed legislation that trans folk can't use a bathroom unless it correlates to their birth certificate, you need to know that so that you can help strategize how they can go to the bathroom safely, right? That's why we had gender neutral bathrooms at General Assembly, because I got tired of walking 4 blocks to my hotel room to go to the bathroom and missing out on all the fun and juicy business, because for me the business is the fun and juicy part of GA. So I'll leave it at that. Follow the guides in the chapter that Sarah and I wrote, and you've got it. You've got what you need. That plus good pastoral care and CPE. Do CPE. It's fantastic. Everybody should do 4 units or more. But I'm biased. UU Lent. So here's one of the things. So I created UU Lent. I created Trust, and I created the Guild of Interreligious Educators, which now has morphed into the something of Transitional Ministries or something like that. I created all three, and part of it was I just wasn't afraid to create something. So if you find a need and you have the passion, right? Howard Thurman said, find the world's need and match it with your passion. It's a very bad rephrasing of his beautiful language because he's a poet and I am not. But that idea, like, just don't be afraid and back off when people push too hard. But for me, for Lent, I was serving a congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, and a UU congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, at a time when Unitarian Universalist religious educators were talking about faith formation as a multi-generational formation. So this came out of John Roberto's Faith Formation 2020. It came out of Meadville Lombard's FOS Collective projects. And so Karen Bellavance Grace, who was doing a UU version of Faith Formation 2020 for UUs. And we knew each other from our religious education circles. And so we started talking about, is there an opportunity here? The UUs have been doing Lent. The Skinner House books, the publishing house, Skinner House Books, exists because they were the ones printing UU Lenten manuals for years. Like that's why we have Skinner House Books. So it's not like we don't have this connection. Both our Unitarian and Universalist heritage brings us to Christianity, or stems out of Christianity. And so I was working in a city where, you go to the grocery store and the first question is, where do you go to work? It's not, how was your day? So I was steeped in this kind of Christian-centric culture with the UU congregation of Atlanta had, 1,000 or so adults. I had 350 children and youth in my program, and I wanted something to engage all the ages. And I saw a Methodist version of what is now UU Lent, which was prompts to take pictures and share them. And this was again like, social media was just kind of in its infancy stages in our usage. And so the first UU Lent was on Tumblr, if you remember Tumblr. But Karen and I created, we sat down and we thought of, what is it, 47 words, I think, because Lent is 40 days, but it doesn't include Sundays. I don't understand that at all, but that's the way real Lent happens. And so we just added the Sundays because it was easier. And we came up with words, and then in answer to that, Lissa, Lent starts this year it started on the 18th, but Lent starts on Ash Wednesday. So it's always Ash Wednesday through Easter. And some of the Christian approaches to Lent, I grew up in the Boston area, very Catholic centric, which is, you deny yourself something, including meat, and then you can have fish on Fridays. Like that's a thing in kind of Irish Christian Catholic modalities. But Lent wasn't always like that. And if you do, multi-Christian understandings of Lent, it often was an opportunity to reconnect with your faith and your spiritual self, to re-engage in spiritual practices. And so Karen and I decided to create something that would invite people into reflection. And the first couple of years, we just did the words. Then, for the last 12 years or so, 10 years or so, Karen stopped doing it, and Alex Capitan, who is a copy editor by training, and I do it. So I do 99% of it, and then Alex makes it look beautiful and make sure I don't misspell anything because, we don't want that level of embarrassment. Um, and then, so about 10 years ago, I decided to start adding a quote as inspiration. Like when we moved over to Facebook, it lent itself to a different level of engagement. And so we moved to having quotes, and I've worked really hard over the years to make sure that the authors of the quotes are not the US majority identity. So most of the people who I quote are people of color, are queer, are women, are trans, live with disabilities, are economically disadvantaged. I have tried really hard, not always successful, and sometimes we use somebody and then years later we found out that they were a horrible human being or they treated others badly, and I try really hard to, we can't go back in history and change that, but I do try to not use them again. And it's a one person project. Like, it has been amazing to me how anti-UU lent some people in our faith have become, or how people are like, why isn't the UUA got this out more? I'm like, every year. I'm like, if I get it out a day before Lent starts, I'm happy. Because again, it's a project of like love. I love offering this to people, but and it's one of those moments. This is why we created Trust, right? It's one of those moments where it's out there and now everybody's like, they don't do it right. And I'm like, you haven't taken the time to learn who they is. But Sean and I knew when we were creating Trust that if it was Barb and Sean saying we need to do this, people wouldn't pay attention to us. But if we said Trust needed us to do this, all of a sudden people paid attention to Trust. So there's a whole sociological study we could do on that, but we don't have time for that today.
Well,
But I
thank
think it is
you.
relevant to educating to counter oppression.
Oh my gosh, all of it is so relevant. Thank you so much, Reverend Mr. Barb Grieve. I hope it's okay if the students email you if they have more questions or reach out. Yeah, I know you're always such a great resource. Yeah, thank you. This was so inspiring. I had a lot of goosebumps, and I always think about, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And it's exciting to know that these 12 Star King students were able to get some of your wisdom. So thank you so much, Barb. Thank you so much. Class, let's plan on taking a 5-minute break and we'll meet back at 4:05. And once again, let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much, Mr. Reverend
Thank you so
Barb
much.
Grieve. See you at 5 minutes,
You're welcome.
class.
I put my email address in there, just so you all hear it from me. I'm usually 2 to 14 days behind my email. If it goes more than 14 days and you haven't heard from me, feel free to ping again. The level of email I get is a little out of my capacity.
For
But that
sure.
said, like, most of it is spam. It's not you all, so don't feel like you're going to be a problem to email me. Just know that I have to get through all the spam to find you.
Thank you so much for all your
Meanwhile,
love.
thank you for being students. Have fun.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, what time did you want us back, Reverend
Let's
Kevin?
have 4:05.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, welcome back. I'm feeling so inspired by just learning so much from Reverend Barb. Hope, yeah, hope you all got a lot of out of that. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes to kind of frame, why, we're having identity groups as part of our educating to counter oppression, and in particular, I'll just share my screen because I did put this on the lesson for all the caucus days. But this is the race-based affinity groups. And the purpose of gathering in a shared identity is a powerful part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. From women gathering conscious raising groups to youth leading vibrant circle worship to Black UUs calling for transformative shifts, identity-based space is a practice of Unitarian Universalist community seeking to address particular spiritual, community, and justice needs of specific identity groups. Examples include Youth Caucus at General Assembly, campus ministries, Trust, Transgender Religious UUs Together, and Black Lives UU. The purpose of gathering in an affinity group is to not force segregation, but rather to create safe and brave space where people can express their fears, pain, and hopes without bystanders, so that when they re-enter mixed identity spaces, it's with greater self-awareness, less self-judgment, and stronger confidence. Identity space can be used to support learning and people across cross-cultural communities. Identity space can help express strong emotions when groups respond to different shared experiences. These groups can deepen spiritual growth around history or ancestry, and helps connect with community. And so that's, the reasons why we're doing this. And so I'm gonna practice this. So create two breakout rooms, let participants choose the room. One room is gonna be our caucus, and then let me rename it. So male and cisgender, and then um, female and transgender.
When you're
And
done with that, Reverend Kevin, you might want to turn off the recording.
oh, yes, thank you. I didn't realize it was still going. Let me do that.